This is Dr. Cengiz Sisman. I would like to welcome you to our new episode of Humans of the Ottoman Empire talk series. And today we will be talking about the Ottoman scholars, Ottoman Ulema. And we have a very dear friend, guest, and colleague, Dr. Khaled El-Rouayheb from Harvard University with us. We are very privileged to have him today with us. And before I am going to introduce him to you, I just would like to say a few things about the agenda of this series. Again, as you remember from our previous talks, this talk series is about humans of the Ottoman Empire, or the agents or actors of the Ottoman Empire. While we are dealing with their stories, unique stories, particular stories, we are also trying to connect their stories to general common human experience. Therefore, we are very much interested in, again, stories of those people. The narrow definition of ulama, or Ottoman scholar, is that they are a body of Muslim scholars recognized as having special knowledge of Islamic law and theology. But was it the case? Was really definition of ulama could be reduced to that they are being Islamic or religious scholars only? So today we will talk about these questions along with many other questions. And as you are going to see, the story is much more complex than this. For example, we will be asking about their main preoccupations, what they were dealing with as their big questions in their life, or how they were spending their daily lives. What was their family or educational backgrounds? What was the general Ottoman scholarly system and network? And perhaps even more importantly, we will be talking, if the time allows it, and their legacy on modern world. I mean, is it a world which is ended or dead, or it is still very much alive? So these are some of the questions that I hope we are going to be dealing with today with Dr. El-Rouayheb. And Dr. El-Rouayheb, as I said, is a very eminent, one of the most eminent scholars on Islamic and Ottoman intellectual history. He is a James Richard Jewett Professor of Arabic and Islamic Intellectual History at the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at Harvard University. His research interest includes, but not limited to, obviously, the intellectual and cultural history of Arabic Islamic world in the early modern period, the history of Arabic logic, Islamic theology, and philosophy. He has a very impressive record of publication, and there is no way for me to give the full list that he first and foremost, published 4 monographs, which is quite admirable in our fields. And he has numerous articles, and all of which are dealing with various aspects of Islamic and Ottoman intellectual and scholarly history. And I believe that many more publications are on the way that we will be seeing in, I hope, near and also far future. So without further ado, I just would like to invite Dr. El-Rouayheb to the podium, to the spotlights, and then start with our basic question about his own story. I mean, how Dr. El-Rouayheb develop an interest into Islamic intellectual history. What is his story? Dr. El-Rouayheb, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. I think, like many scholars or academics, I started, my interests were formed in my graduate years as a graduate student, and I was reading biographical dictionaries, collections of short biographical entries on scholars from the Ottoman period, and I was fascinated by the world. These were highly educated, very bookish scholars in a society that was still a very high percentage of illiteracy. the breadth of their knowledge and their interests fascinated me. And they were also human, like modern academics. They had their rivalries and jealousies, and which made them human as well. And I have been working on aspects of ulama culture, ulama intellectual life, more or less ever since.
Lovely. That's so great. Now let's just then start with the basic questions about ulama. I mean, who were the Ottoman ulama? How should we define them? I mean, can we define them as being just religious scholars only, or they were more than that? And also, were they a privileged class, members of which mainly resided in major Ottoman cities, and not like going out of those centers? I mean, who are these people, and how should we define them?
Yes, as with many similar interesting questions, the answers are usually a little bit not very straightforward. So in a sense, they were religious scholars in the sense that their legitimacy, their sociological legitimacy was to a large extent based on them being the repositories of religious law and religious thought. They were widely considered to be so-called the inheritors of the prophets. And so in this respect, their legitimacy was to a large extent based on religion, but they were polymaths, and their interests and their expertise was not limited to the religious sciences. This is a common misconception. And of course, when we talk about ulama, it literally just means learned. So I think we can understand it in a broad sense. So if anyone is learned, well, there were learned women, there were learned non-Muslims, but it can also be understood in a narrower sense with a core of people who were attached to the institution of the madrasa and from where the Ottoman state derived its judges. In this sense, it's a narrower it's a narrower group, typically scholars of a particular legal school, the Hanafi school, and would staff the Ottoman bureaucracy, at least the judiciary of the Ottoman state.
So you are saying that a narrower definition would be that they are being Islamic scholars, but if we just take the term with a stretch, then they could be in general like learned men who could be educated or not educated in madrasa, or they could be also self-educated people coming from all walks of life.
Or women. There are learned women in the Ottoman Empire. Maybe not as many as we would have liked, but they exist, and there are lots of examples of that as well.
Right. Speaking of which, I mean, like, can we just talk about then their educational background? I mean, how were they typically getting their educations? From their families or from the schools? You already mentioned the term madrasa for those who are unfamiliar with the term. Can we also call it like Islamic colleges, madrasas as being Islamic colleges?
Yes, madrasas were colleges and often financed by pious endowments. People would set aside some sources of income, and this could often be political leaders, but also very wealthy subjects of the Ottoman state. Typically, the elementary education would have been outside of the madrasa, often at home if one's parents could afford it. Often in the scribal schools, in the Quran schools. There are a number of examples of scholars who came from modest backgrounds, so I do not think that it was in any way unusual for someone, a smart boy of a modest background, to make it into the ranks of the Ottoman ulama. But madrasas themselves tended to be more what we would consider maybe high school, college level, and They were different in different parts of the Ottoman Empire, but at least in the central Ottoman lands, they tended to have, there was a hierarchy of colleges. There was an expectation of what kinds of disciplines you study at what point in your educational career, and which handbooks, textbooks you would start with when you started studying. And these were part of the general expectation.
But speaking of that, curriculum, I mean, can we just then say a little bit more about, what kind of educations were given in those, again, so-called Islamic colleges or high schools or colleges?
Yes, so typically, especially at the early stages, there would have been a lot of Arabic and lots of Arabic language, grammar. The memorization of the Quran would typically have taken place at an earlier stage. But of course, we have to remember that in the Ottoman state, Arabic was not the spoken tongue of a large proportion of the citizens. And even those who did speak Arabic spoke colloquial Arabic, and they would still need to be exposed to the world of classical Arabic and classical Arabic grammar, classical Arabic rhetoric. There would be exposure to Islamic law, and there would be exposure to Islamic theology, which would often be quite philosophically demanding. And there would be a lot of emphasis as well on logic, both formal logic and the theory of argumentation. Interestingly enough, it seems that Quran and Hadith sciences were studied at a very advanced level. Typically only after one had mastered grammar, logic, theology, then one would move on at the very highest levels to study Hadith and Quran. Maybe not what one would expect, given the assumption that they were religious scholars.
Right. Well, I mean, given the fact that we are talking about a huge geographical homeland, right, stretching from North Africa to today's Middle East and to Balkans and you name it, it's a huge geography. And also, we are talking about a very large span of time, like 4, 5, 6 centuries, depending on the locations that we are talking about. I mean, the curriculum, was it standardized at some point, or the level of educations are more or less the same, say, at the centers and at the peripheries or at other places? I mean, can we just say about this standardization, so to speak, if there was any?
No, lovely question. A lovely question. Clearly, there were regional differences. So the curriculum and the Azhar in Egypt, even though it was part of the Ottoman Empire, would have looked significantly different than what it would have looked like in Istanbul. Partly as a function of the fact that Egyptian scholars were inheritors of their own intellectual tradition stemming from the Mamluk period. Most of them would have belonged to different legal schools than the Turkish-speaking Ottoman scholars. They would have their own textbooks. There was some overlap, of course. These were people who could talk together, but there were regional differences, definitely. And the level of standardization may have been stronger in the core areas of the Ottoman Empire, which would also typically is the place where the Ottoman judges came from, than in the provinces where typically the curriculum seems to have been less formalized.
I mean, you already began to talk about this structure of a network of scholars, and also the way they are being educated and appointed to different states. Can you just briefly talk about this structure and how the whole system, at least probably in pre-modern times, pre-19th century times, and how that picture looked like? I mean, was there any centralized authority which was overseeing everything, and then the hierarchy was trickling down? Can you just tell a little bit about this picture?
Yes. It's difficult to talk about these things without going into a lot of technical details about which institutions. Yes, of course. Yes, of course, there was an oversight of the educational system, particularly in the core areas of the Ottoman Empire, Istanbul and its environs, and the head of the so-called Ilmiya, the class of Ottoman scholars, would have been the Sheikhul Islam, or sometimes translated into English as the Grand Mufti of Istanbul. And clearly this person oversaw, and his associates oversaw, the promotion of scholars from less prestigious madrasas to more prestigious madrasas that typically also gave a higher salary. And there was since the 16th century, probably even since the 15th century, there was a progression. You had to spend so and so much time as a teacher in one of the lower paid madrasas before you could then proceed to some of the higher level madrasas. And at any point in time in the progression, you could sort of step sideways and you could step into the judiciary. You could start pursuing a judiciary career instead of a teaching career. It was probably more hierarchically organized in the core areas of the Ottoman Empire than any other place in the Islamic world. And there even seems to have been examinations for entry into the higher ranks of the ulama, which is quite unusual in an Islamic context, to have sort of centralized examinations where people would be examined by a certain scholar, often called the Mumayyiz, and we actually have fascinating records of exam questions that were posed from the 17th and 18th centuries. And again, maybe surprisingly, most of these exam questions had nothing to do with hadith or Quran. These would typically be questions about Arabic language, grammar, rhetoric. Rhetoric was very popular as well.
I mean, you already mentioned that there are some high or more prestigious, madrasas. So I assume that there was also the Harvard of, madrasas. I mean, which would that be in the Ottoman context? Which would be Ivy League schools, so to speak?
Yeah, as I'm sure you know, in Istanbul, there was the so-called 8 schools, Sahni Saman, which were considered to be the pinnacle of the educational system. But of course, if you go to Egypt, Azhar was emerging in the Ottoman period as the center of learning in the Arabic-speaking Middle East. In the Mamluk period, the Azhar was not that prominent. It became much more prominent during the Ottoman period.
That's interesting. Was it would Azhar be in a competition with, say, Süleymaniye being probably top school in Istanbul? Would that be those two schools would be competing in any sense?
I don't have the sense that there was a competition. The distances were far, the regional traditions were strong. And of course, we should also not forget that just to go back to a question I did not answer about the urban centeredness of most, but actually as you go to the east, eastern Anatolia, northern Iraq, in the Kurdish-speaking areas, there was a very interesting phenomenon of rural-based madrasas, often of very high caliber. And the same happens as well in North Africa, in the highlands of Morocco. This is maybe the exception. It was usually the most prestigious madrasas would have been in cities, but there was also rural extensions.
Yeah, great. I want to still talk a bit more about the curriculum, the things that they've been studying. Yeah, you already mentioned that all the religious learnings there, but there are some common conceptions or misconceptions about the madrasa curriculum in especially popular parlance, that they stopped being interested in natural and rational sciences at some point. I mean, the question would be, at what point, if there was such a thing, and did they really stop being interested in rational and then philosophical subjects?
Yes, excellent question. It is a popular misconception, and even I would say until the 70s and 1980s, even many Ottomanists also believed that at some point, probably around the late 16th, early 17th century, there was a reaction against the study of natural philosophy in Ottoman madrasas. and other rational sciences. I think more recent research has overturned this view. I think it's quite clear that there was never any reaction against the natural sciences. Astronomy and natural philosophy was a core part of the curriculum in Ottoman madrasas down to the 19th century. There is no point at which we could say that they stopped doing that. And we know which books they studied. We know that these were very intensively studied. There were some sciences that were typically studied outside of the madrasas. So, for example, it seems that medicine would have typically been studied outside of the madrasas. Also, things what we might today call pseudoscience, but at the time were not considered maybe so, like astrology, typically also
alchemy, probably.
Alchemy, yes, typically outside of the madrasa. Sufism was also typically it was also outside of the madrasa. Most madrasas trained ulama would also have been members of Sufi orders. There were not anti-Sufi in any way, but typically Sufism and the Sufi orders was a different side of education as well.
Yeah, I mean, since we are talking about scholars, not necessarily, ulama only.
Yes.
I mean, there were definitely different, dealings with different parts of sciences at several different levels. And also, my understanding is that, an ulama could be a religious scholar, but at the same time, that person could be a bureaucrat or a soldier or like Sufi or scientist, probably, they had, there were times that those people, at least some of them, had multiple roles to play in society, right?
Yes, very important point. And we might talk a little bit about the careers of particular people and see how that would work.
I mean, if you have any particular person in mind, again, we are very much appreciative of the story.
Yeah, so in the 18th
person in mind.
In the 18th century, when the Ottomans set up the Naval Military Academy in Istanbul, the person who was hired initially to teach mathematics and geometry was a madrasa-trained scholar, Ismail Galenbevi, who had gone through a madrasa training, just like everyone else. But he had been interested in mathematics and astronomy, and it was not rare, and it was natural that he spent a spell studying or teaching at the Naval Military Academy in Istanbul. And after doing that for a few years, he became a judge, and I think he passed away when he was a judge. So he went from mudarris in a normal madrasa to a teacher of mathematics and academy to being a judge. So that would be, for example, one example. And we're talking here second half of the 18th century.
Absolutely. There were always some interesting figures and exceptional figures here and there. If we just look at their major preoccupations, I know this is another difficult question, so hard to answer, giving a general answer about this one. But if you look at their major preoccupations, what were some of their major dealings? I mean, what were the big questions that they were after? I mean, what was the ultimate goal of this system, if there was any? I mean, because this question is important for me, since I'm also trying to, again, connect these stories to this global common humanity thing.
Yes.
And then to see whether they were dealing with similar questions, which were like that of the questions of Christians or Buddhists or people from other parts of the world.
Yes. No, a good question, also a difficult question to answer in a few words, of course. Clearly, a lot of Ottoman scholars were interested in what you rightly call the big questions, faith and the role of reason in faith and religious faith. To what extent were some of the theories that had emanated from historically from the Greek philosophers, Aristotle and Aristotelian physics and Aristotelian metaphysics, to what extent were these compatible with the Islamic creed? To what extent would they need to be refined or reformed or revised? There is a famous incident in the 15th century when Mehmed the Conqueror commissioned two scholars in Istanbul to write adjudications of the views of the theologians and the falasifa, the Neoplatonic Aristotelian philosophers, and they presented him with their own writings on this field. And this is one of those cases of also jealousy, where the Sultan rewarded one scholar more than the other, and the other person was mortally offended and supposedly left the Ottoman realms and went back to Central Asia. So this was definitely a part of their intellectual concerns. There was also, I mean, scholars of Renaissance Europe talk a lot about education as self-fashioning. I think a lot of the Ottoman scholars considered their education as self-fashioning. It was considered to be part of being a cultivated person, that you were not too specialized, that you had a broad grounding in a range of disciplines, even though you might be particularly specialized in one thing, but it was expected that you would be a polymath, that you would know a lot of poetry, you would know a lot of history. In the core areas of the Ottoman Empire, typically you would be able to read and converse in Arabic and Persian and Turkish. There was this element of education as self-fashioning, and this was very important. So maybe they would not be too happy with our modern contemporary trend to hyper-specialization. They would have thought that to be not the purpose of education.
You already talk about this, the Greek or pre-Ottoman sciences and the roots of Ottoman sciences. Maybe that would be the time also to talk about the roots, intellectual roots of Ottoman scholarly tradition, if I may say.
Yes.
Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, the Ottoman scholarly tradition is, of course, especially in its origin, continuous with the broader Islamic intellectual tradition and scholarly tradition. There was, particularly in the 14th, 15th century, there was, of course, a lot of influx of scholars into Anatolia and the various Turkish beyliks in Anatolia, one of which was the Ottoman, seeking court patronage, teaching positions. Many of these scholars brought with them, of course, the intellectual traditions of Central Asia and Persia. Up until the middle of the 15th century, many Ottoman scholars would also go to Egypt, particularly for their most advanced education. After Mehmed the Conqueror set up the 8 schools in Istanbul, there was some evidence to suggest that he actually did not really encourage his scholars to go to Cairo anymore. He wanted them to complete their education in Istanbul. There's a nice anecdote of the grandson of Mehmet Fenari, one of the great Ottoman scholars, who sought permission from the Sultan to go to Cairo and finish his study of Arabic grammar, and the Sultan gave permission, but was clearly unhappy about this. So, of course, there was this continuity with the intellectual traditions of Central Asia, with Persia, and to some extent with Egypt. After the foundation of the 8 schools in Istanbul, the connection with Egypt was weakened. And I think after the Safavids came to power in Persia in the early 16th century, and Shiaism became state religion in Iran. That also stopped this flow of Eastern scholars to some extent, never completely, but it did stop the flow of Eastern scholars in, which actually allowed, in a way, the Ottoman lands, the core Ottoman lands, to develop more their own distinct intellectual traditions that had slightly different emphases than elsewhere in the Islamic world.
I was going to ask about that, Ottoman uniqueness in a minute. But before that, let's just try to talk a little bit about more this interconnectedness. I mean, yes, I mean, part of this, one of the goals of this, series, at least this conversation, was to show that Ottoman history was unique in one sense, but at the same time, it was part of the global history.
Yes.
At every level. I mean, it's scholarly, military, economic, you name it. So in that regard, connections and interconnections, showing interconnections and interconnectedness are quite very important. So by way of showing this interconnectedness, can you make a little bit more like a comparison between Ottoman ulama and then say Shia ulama and maybe Mughal ulama? And if you want to stretch a bit more, even like Christian ulama in Europe, if there was any.
Yes. Yeah, excellent question. Again, a wide-ranging question as well.
Absolutely.
It does seem as if in the core areas of the Ottoman Empire, the ulama were slightly more integrated into the state structure than was typical in the Safavid or Mughal empires. Though there too, there are strong similarities as well, but the level of bureaucratization of the ulama institution was probably higher in the core areas of the Ottoman Empire. The intellectual interests were very continuous. There was, I would actually say that if we look at the interests of the scholars of Istanbul, they were probably more continuous with those of the scholars in Iran and Mughal India than they were continuous with those of North Africa, for example, which had their own, because these Turkey, Iran, Northern India were all inheritors of the Timurid intellectual tradition, whereas North Africa, Egypt and North Africa tended to be quite distinct as well. But of course, allowance has to be made for the fact that after the 16th century, Iran was Shia, but still when they studied Arabic grammar, or when they studied Arabic rhetoric, or when they studied philosophy, a lot of the works were common. Having said that, of course, there was some elements within the Turkish ulama who were not too happy about the very intense study of philosophy and metaphysics that they sometimes associated with Persia. But there was never any consensus on this point. There were also lots of Turkish scholars who did continue the study of metaphysics and natural philosophy. In terms of logic and the theory of argumentation, I would say the interest of the Ottoman ulama was probably second to none in those disciplines. But again, with their own emphases, because after around the 1500s, there was still some, but there was little traffic between these three big gunpowder empires, the Iran, India, and the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, but again, it's a big question, and I'm sure one can say more.
Absolutely, but especially in the 17th century, where I mean, you are an expert. I mean, your expertise lies on. I mean, it seems that there was more traffic between at least Ottoman Empire and then Mughal Empire at so many different levels.
The Mecca and Medina were very important cities and very cosmopolitan in the sense that you could have the confluence of very different scholars with different traditions meeting each other, interchanging ideas. In the 17th century, there was also a lot of border disputes between the Safavids and the Ottomans, and many Sunni scholars who were Azeri or Kurds moved westwards and had a powerful influence on the Ottoman scholarly tradition. Yes, so
that would bring us to another big question, whether there was then a unique, say, Ottoman ulama or unique Ottoman Islam, or was there any uniqueness in that?
Yes, another great question. I think there is a distinct intellectual tradition in Anatolia and the Balkans, which would have been recognizable by the 17th, 18th century. It was probably not so much recognizable, say, in the 15th century, where there was still a lot of incoming scholars coming in from the East all the time. That tradition is distinct. It was, so by the 17th, 18th century, the core areas of the Ottoman Empire formed a distinct intellectual tradition. They were studying particular works. When they were pursuing logic, they were doing it in distinctive ways. When they were pursuing Arabic grammar, they were pursuing it in instinctive ways. But we need to be careful about using maybe Ottoman, because I think the regional traditions in Egypt, say, or Algeria or Tunisia were very different from the traditions in the core areas of the Ottoman Empire. So we would need to talk about the plural and Ottoman intellectual traditions and not just one.
Great, yeah. Great. That's an absolute excellent point to make, to remind us that, again, there was not a monolithic Ottoman experience again in any fields. You didn't make any stretch to Christian comparison to Christian ulama and Ottoman ulama.
No,
I mean, one of the common assumptions is that while there was this clergy in Christian world or Christian tradition, I mean, Ottoman or Islamic tradition did not have a clergy. I mean, was it the case, or is it fair to make that assumption?
Of course, that's true. So the Ottoman ulama played no liturgical function like priests, right?
Right.
But it is true that they formed a class of people who had distinctive ethos, who dressed distinctively, and whose legitimacy was based on them being repositories of the religious tradition. To that extent, they are similar to the monks and priests of Christianity in the Middle Ages, particularly, where they tended to be the repositories of learning. But the Ottoman ulama also have a lot in common, or something in common at least, with the Mandarins in Chinese history, right?
I see.
Because they were polymaths, they were the learned, and they typically served the state in the form of judges. So I would say the Ottoman ulama is sort of in between what we would associate with the Christian clergy and with the Chinese Mandarin class.
But I mean, more or less, though, I mean, it seems that the Ottoman ulama were more integrated to state bureaucracy.
Yes.
And there were times that they were used by political authorities to legitimize their actions. But there were also times that we see that they challenged political authorities. I mean, that was not very common, but there were times.
Yeah.
The popular question would be, I mean, could they be powerful enough, for example, to challenge sultanic authority? That institution at large, or,
yes,
people in particular, could they dare?
It's a great question. As you rightly point out, there were tensions, and I think any prudent Ottoman ruler, whether it's a sultan or a governor, would be ill-advised not to take into account the sentiments of the ulama or the protests of the ulama. Despite all of this outdated talk about Oriental despotism, it's quite clear that the general understanding of everyone in this period was that the Sultan did not have legislative authority. the Sultan might promote some interpretation of the Sharia and enshrine it in the Qanun, but the idea that the Sultan could make or unmake laws at whim was not part of the general understanding. The judiciary and the legislative, so to speak, was in the hands of the ulama class. They were the ones who interpreted God's law, not the Sultan, not the viziers. The Sultan and the viziers could try to get around things, but they did not have legislative authority. This sounds maybe like a very drastic statement, but I would be prepared to defend it. And I think the Qanun thing has been misunderstood. The state promulgated laws, because they were clearly done with a lot of ulama input, and they also never were intended to supplement the Sharia, the religious law of Islam. They were supposed to give a specific interpretation of it. And so there, yes, they were a constraint on the despotic powers of a governor or a sultan in the Ottoman period.
Right. I mean, since you mentioned this Qanun and Sharia thing, these are two technical terms, but one is referring to more or less like sultanic law, or like translate as sultanic law. The other one is Islamic law. And then some scholars dare to say that that distinction was also the root of Ottoman proto-secularism too, but that would be, a bit of too technical discussion at the moment. It would be suffice to just say that, there's this interesting distinction there to be acknowleded.
Yes.
I have like a few other questions, but I would like to also invite our listeners to ask questions. We do have a QA box. I mean, instead of like writing your questions to the chat box, I would really, invite you to write your questions to QA box. And I'm hoping that we are going to devote some time answering those questions at the end. So still, I have more questions for you, or more conversational topics rather for you. We have been talking about like authority and power of ulama up until 17th, 18th, even 19th century for sure. But by the 18th and 19th century, we are now also facing the rise of modern sciences and also scholars, modern scholars, or scientists, to be precise. What were their reaction to these new phenomenon in the empire, also in the larger global world? Because the common assumption was that they were, common assumption was also some of an essentialistic assumption approach too, putting all the ulama, all the people, under the same category. But the assumption was that they were obstacles to reforms and modernity and modernizations. And they were reactionary and conservative overall. There is definitely truth in it, but I'm sure the story is more complex than that. I mean, what would you say about their reaction to the rise of modern world, so to speak?
Yes, I would agree with you that it was multifaceted. It's true that they were on the whole conservative, but conservative does not always mean reactionary or unyielding. They just wanted measured change as opposed to sort of sweeping change. I would say that it would be naive to expect a scholarly class of any civilization that is inheritors of a proud and sophisticated intellectual tradition to simply lay down everything and wait for instructions from the West. That I think would be naive. So it's to be expected that they would have been skeptical of certain Western ideas when they first arrived. But I think it's much too sweeping to portray them as systematically opposed. So there are just too many examples of the sultans seeking and obtaining favorable fatwas to do military reform, to set up printing presses, to sort of portray them as systematically hostile to any attempt at reform or any attempt at modernization. I don't think that's true to the facts. And clearly resistance, there are many cases where resistance to reform came not from the Ottoman ulama, but came from, say, the established military, like the Janissaries, where actually the Shaykh al-Islam was siding with the Sultan. And there are examples where the Shaykh al-Islam sides with those who are opposed to the Sultan's reforms, but I don't think there's any consistent picture. And yeah, please.
Yeah, great, great. So I want to ask, also another popular question for you. I mean, if you want to name 3, Ottoman star ulama, I mean, which names would come to your mind first? I mean, just give us 3 big guys, three big names.
Well, I think from 3 very different periods. So Mullah Fenari was born in the middle of the 14th century, died in the early 15th, 1431. He was active before the Ottoman conquest of Istanbul. He was in Bursa, which was then the Ottoman sort of intellectual capital. He wrote on Sufism and on Hanafi jurisprudence, the Islamic jurisprudence of the Hanafi school, and on logic. So a quite unusual sort of combination of expertise, which is quite indicative. A second figure I would say would be Tashkur Pruzadeh, who was active
16th century.
In the 16th century during the reign of Sulaiman the Magnificent. Was educated mostly in Bursa, but became judge of Istanbul. This is maybe around the time when Istanbul is starting to outshine Bursa. He wrote a biographical dictionary of Ottoman scholars. He wrote an encyclopedia, one of the most extensive encyclopedia of the sciences in Islamic civilization. And a third person is the person I mentioned, Ismail Gelenbevi, who was an 18th century scholar and actually introduced the mathematics of logarithms into Turkish, and wrote a very interesting logic handbook in the 1760s that became to be widely studied in the 19th century in the Ottoman lands. I think 3 scholars, very eminent from very different periods of Islamic civilization. And I would maybe also, if we are interpreting the concept of ulama more widely, I mean, I would also mention the 18th century female poet, Zubaydah Fitnet Hanem, who was became one of the prominent poets of her age. So maybe not an alim in a strict sense, but definitely a learned and widely respected poet.
Great. I mean, thanks for all the to-the-point answers. My next would be if we are all somewhat revisionist historians, I mean, if you were to say write a new textbook about Ottoman history of Ottoman scholarly tradition, not ulama but scholarly traditions, what were the few mischaracterizations or misconceptions about that tradition that you would like to fix in your textbook?
Yeah.
What are some of the misconceptions that you keep hearing, for example?
I mean, one of the most widespread, and I would probably emphasize, would be the idea that they are religious scholars, almost exclusively interested in Islamic law, Islamic theology, and maybe a little bit of Arabic grammar, and that was it. And that they were pedants who wrote simply commentaries and super commentaries and were not original. And that when the empire was trying to modernize in the 18th, 19th centuries, that they were sort of a reactionary group, all of which I think are misconceptions. And I would also try to, we are, all of us, I think, I don't exempt myself, but we are all sort of inclined to write Ottoman history with one eye towards Europe. Always comparing and contrasting, and I would hope that maybe a newer generation of scholars will start maybe looking at say the comparisons with the Mandarins of China, for example, and look more globally, I think, and have more global comparisons.
Great. I mean, I have also like about the legacy questions, but we have now questions are showering. So I just would like to be fair to our listeners and answer try to answer some of their questions. I mean, one of our listeners is asking, whose name is not here, anonymous attendee. He or she says there is a hypothesis that the alliance between the state and ulama gradually hindered intellectual creativity in the Ottoman Empire. Actually, the argument goes even further, saying that that alliance killed the creativity in the Islamic tradition too. I'm just making this question a bit broader. The question is whether do you agree with this assumption? It's another big one.
Yeah. Well, no, I don't agree. I don't agree with that. And I think that the alliance between the ulama and the state. So one way I would argue this is say the alliance between the ulama and the state was not nearly as strong, say, in the provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So, say in Egypt, and I don't see sort of much more flourishing intellectual life, say in Egypt, than I do, say, in Istanbul. So I wouldn't defend that view. It is probably, I mean, it's possible that the rise of the madrasa system with the Seljuks and the fact that the ulama became associated with the madrasa system might have changed slightly the character of intellectual production. And so it might be that the fact that people started to write very short handbooks and then commentaries on them might have been a reflection of this spread of the madrasa system. And that changes maybe the character, but I wouldn't say that it necessarily lowers the standards in any way.
This is again a major Orientalist question that we need to spend probably another hour or hours to answer sufficiently, really. But thank you very much for your answer. Victor Bonilla is asking about the interaction between ulama and other groups being like Christians and Jews and other scholars. Yes. I mean, now this is me coming into picture saying that yes, there was a great interaction, say in Baghdad of 10th century or Cordoba of 11th century. But now we are asking you, could we or do we see something similar happening in the Ottoman Empire?
There are stories of interaction. There are stories of people studying across confessional boundaries. So there are stories, say, of Arabic-speaking Christians studying Arabic grammar in Aleppo with a Muslim alim who was part member of the ulama, who was an expert in Arabic grammar. I don't also want to portray this as the norm. It did happen, and it's important to emphasize that it did happen. But it is also, I think, true to say that to some extent, these were parallel worlds. And that we would have maybe, it would have been good had there been more interaction. I think in a way, some Ottoman, particularly Ottoman court from the 17th century and onwards, seemed to be interested in European learning. So there was translations of Western philosophical and scientific works starting from the 17th century and on, sponsored by the court. And sometimes native Christians or Ottoman Christians would have been involved in some of this translation activity. That would be another example. But there are also examples, sadly, of religious prejudice on both sides throughout the centuries.
One question was more practically asking about the size of this class. I mean, population, percentage-wise. Can we have any figure as to the size of the group? And maybe related to that, another question, their impact on our listeners asking their impact on social policies, day-to-day practices in the Ottoman Empire.
Yes. I don't have figures in my head, I'm afraid.
I don't have anyone too. I mean,
yeah.
I don't believe that there is anyone. We can talk about the numbers.
Yes,
Of any
it's
specific.
possible that Madeline Zilfi's book from 1988 might have on the post-classical Ottoman ulama might have some statistical information, but I'm not familiar with it off the top of my head. Social policies, yes, I think again when governors or sultans were faced with disorder, with price rises, they had to take into account the ulama, because often the ulama commanded respect on the street. So in this respect, they would have to take the ulama into account. And often the ulama would act as intermediaries between, say, protesters or rioters who were upset about price rises or things like that, and the political authorities. And even, of course, also in the 19th century, when the Ottomans tried to reform their laws and to do the Tanzimat reforms, they had to take into account what the ulama thought, and this was challenging. This was challenging.
Yes.
There were some aspects of the Tanzimat reform that many ulama were against. But it would not have been politic to simply ignore what they said or what they thought, and it was more of an ongoing dialogue and compromise and negotiations.
As an extension of one of our earlier questions, again, another anonymous listener is asking whether ulema played an active role in combating the encroachment of materialist or modern thoughts in the 18th and 19th centuries. Were they active in that?
That's a good question, and it's slightly beyond my expertise, because now we're looking at, say, 19th, 20th century and the way they reacted against, say, positive thought or something. Clearly, some of the major Ottoman ulama from the late 19th, early 20th century were vocally opposed to materialism and positivism coming in from the West. And some of them actually, after the foundation of the Turkish Republic, actually sought refuge in other parts of the Islamic world, like Egypt, for example. But it's also true that some Ottoman scholars were willing to interact with some of these new scientific thoughts and new scientific philosophies. So there's at least one 19th century scholar who wrote a book where presenting the views of the French positivists, but at the same time, and not clearly against them, but clearly also whilst remaining grounded in the Islamic intellectual tradition.
Awesome. Another listener is asking, could you name some original ideas or thoughts conceived by Ottoman scholars? Anything unique apparently to Ottoman thinkers or scholars?
Yes,
that you can think of?
It's a justified question, and my answer, I don't want my answer to be interpreted as, oh well, there are only these one or two examples. These are simply the examples that I've happened to work on. So in logic, I wrote one of my books on logical innovations by Ottoman scholars from the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly in expanding the Aristotelian theory of syllogism. And in my book on the 17th century, I had devoted a chapter to the first major work written by an Ottoman scholar in the 17th century on the proprieties of reading. How do you, the adab al-mutala, how should one read with maximum effect? This is not something that one finds a parallel to in previous times. Are there other such innovations? I'm sure they are. It's just that we have not studied Ottoman intellectual output or we've only just started to study Ottoman intellectual output seriously, partly because of the assumption that there is nothing to look for. There's just, they were just religious scholars, they were reactionary, they were just doing, their intellectual interests were very narrow, so that has not encouraged people to actually look at their contributions.
One of our listeners from chat, I'm sorry that I'm not looking at the chat often, I rather look at the QA box, but a question from chat asking whether we can talk about an Islamic enlightenment, since it's, you know, somewhat you know, provocative question, that's why I'm asking. Can we talk about like an Islamic enlightenment in the 18th and 19th century, especially among the ulama?
This theory has been put forward, and I think it's of great interest. And I think it has been good that we have discussed this and tried to answer the question. I personally think that, and maybe I'm a minority here, but I would rather that instead of we take an ism that has already been developed in Western historiography, humanism, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and then simply, oh, let's try to find the equivalence in our... I would rather see that we come up with our own concepts. Look at the evidence, look at the output, come up with our own story as opposed to always following the tune of Western historiography. That is my own inclination.
All right. That's great. So we are really coming to the end of the program. So I am going to merge one of the questions coming from our audience with my own question about legacy. I was going to ask you about their legacy in today's world, and our listener is asking, what is their role today? I know that it's still a stretch, you know, in your area of research, but if you comment or say a few things about the role of ulema or scholarly tradition in modern world.
There's a nice saying that half of knowledge is to say I don't know. I mean, part of being an academic is to know when one does not know, and
absolutely.
I don't think that I am particularly well placed to answer this question. I do think that when modern sciences and modern educational institutions started to be introduced into the Ottoman Empire in the second half of the 18th century and in the 19th century, the fact that some of these early schools could draw on ulama who had been who studied mathematics and geometry and things like that suggests that their talents were called for and were transferable to some extent. But to say much more than that and going and say into the 20th century and what their role is, the ulama tradition is still alive. It's not part of the past. And whether it's in the Arabic-speaking world or in Turkey or in other parts of the Islamic world, the ulama tradition is still, it has not been displaced entirely by modernity. It has been challenged by modernity. It has maybe been moved to the periphery in some cases, but it's still with us. And
I think that would be also the case for all the scholars of other religions too. I mean, you know, in Judaism, Christianity, all other religions too, they were faced, they were challenged by modernity and enlightenment, and then they refashioned themselves, and then they put forward their theories in modern vocabularies, and they are here still, again, in different disguises, basically. And I think this is the case for Islam too. All right, thank you very, very much, Dr. El-Rouayheb. I mean, thanks for spending your precious time with us, and thanks to all other listeners and audience who have been with us attentively in last hour. And I also would like to thank to Yunus Emre Institute one more time, who which is providing this opportunity to us to talk on scholarly things on a popular level. And thank you very much to all again.
And thank you to you for guiding the discussion so wonderfully.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I hope that we will see each other in other occasions, and I hope to continue this program in coming weeks and months. Okay, have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.